Influx now. I'm so glad to have you with us.
Good morning, Patty. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Today we're going to be talking about the rental market in the U.S. and the changes that have happened. Can you tell us what your new analysis in the rental market in the U.S. has found? I'm interested to learn about what's going on.
Certainly, happy to. So, we had a hypothesis that COVID, particularly with everyone going to a work from home scenario, we wanted to see the effect of that on renter migration. Did the work from home cause renters to quote unquote flee or move from urban core centers? And we had a hypothesis around that, but we wanted that to be validated with the data. And so that created the concept of this study. And that's exactly what the study proved out, is that when we looked at all of our renter applicants in our database, almost 50% of those renter applicants moved out of state, which is a startling number. It was actually 42% in all that moved out of state during 2020 and 2021. So a lot of U-Hauls across the roads and highways of America during that time. So when we started looking at why and what caused this, one core reason, right, which is people now have choices on where they can live. They no longer need to be tied to their work location and have the same zip code as their work location. And they have options now in terms of where they can live. So rather than pay the high cost in a sort of core urban downtown area, I can now move to a suburban area or a rural area, get more space, and pay at least half of the price that I was paying living in a core dense area. And so the idea of less costly housing, the idea of more space, which people started to want because of COVID and working from home, really drove a lot of these renters out much further than they would normally consider if they had to go into their offices. And so that is really what our study proved out, was that hypothesis. When we see 42% moving out of state, 28% of all the renter applicants in that period moved to rural areas. Again, all in the spirit of lowering my cost of housing, in some cases moving closer back to family, to have a family support system around me. There was also a consolidation of families where, kid graduated, student graduated, moved to an area where their job was, doesn't need to be there anymore, move back home. That's what a lot of the evidence is in this study. That's one part of it, actually.
It sounds like a real quality of life change for people. I mean, to go from an inner city close to work to more space, more breathing room, closer to family.
Yeah.
I would imagine that there's, been a happiness increase.
That is an outstanding point, and thank you for bringing that up, because that is exactly right. I think, and this is, my feeling is that when people did this, it was a quality of life change. It was a way to reinvest in themselves as well, and be in a very different environment than what they had to be in. Again, these were choices that are now available to these individuals. And a lot of them used COVID as an opportunity to reflect, revisit where they were at, and reinvent themselves. And part of that reinvention was going out to areas where there was that space for breathing room, like you described. And yes, and hopefully increase that happiness quotient.
Do you think that, obviously with this movement and change in domicile and location, how did that impact the rent, the cost of rent?
Right. So the cost of rent as a whole, as we all know, has gone up. The cost of rent has gone up for a number of reasons. The people moving to suburban areas and rural areas now started to create a demand in those areas, right? And so whenever there's demand, prices will naturally go up, whether it's for gasoline or for a rental property. And so those prices have certainly gone up, but so have the urban prices. Prices across the U.S., rental rates across the U.S. on average increased 14% over the course of the last 12 months.
Wow.
Yeah, and so 14%, what's considered,
Considerable.
it's considerable when you think about the high market cities like New York and LA, et cetera, those West Coast and those Northeast markets. Typically you should have 30% of your income going towards housing. In some of those markets it's far more than 30%. In some of those markets it exceeds 40%. And so moving into rural and suburban areas, you can see why that becomes a really attractive option. And so part of the migration pattern we saw are actually people moving out of California, for example, and Texas becoming the biggest recipient of the renter migration across the entire U.S. Florida and the Carolinas became the recipients of renters moving out of New York. New York had the highest decline in renters because they were all moving down to the Carolinas and Florida. Texas had the biggest gain in renters, largely driven by California and the tech industry. In terms of rental rates, where renters go, rates go up. Where there's demand, rates go up. When there's low supply, rates go up. But compounding that also, when we think about single-family homes last year, reaching astronomical asking prices, homeowners wanted to cash out and make hay while the sun shines. And so they did, right? And I'm sure we all have an example of somebody we know who cashed out at those high prices last year. Where are they going to move to? They moved into rentals. And so that added a whole new renter pool that the industry doesn't usually see, constraining the supply and the choices. And in addition to that, now with the higher mortgage interest rates, renters who would typically move out and go into first-time home ownership have not and are not. They're delaying that decision until the market becomes more favorable to buy a home. So now as a result of that, you're not getting any opening in the inventory because of that, because these folks are going to stay in rental housing for longer than they thought. So there are a lot of dynamics at play, and we've looked at a lot of these dynamics in that study, which really does make it a very interesting read on how COVID has really reshaped rental housing from that perspective.
Well, Maitri, this is so fascinating. I'm sure that this will have ripple effects for years to come as well. And it's wonderful that you've been able to shine a light on these important changes in the landscape, in home ownership and rental landscape.
Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to do so.